Good evening. My name's Paul Fletcher. I'm a psychiatrist and a cognitive neuroscientist, and I'm very grateful to you for logging on this evening to share, I hope, my enthusiasm for the remarkable potential of video games in science and psychiatry. I'm currently standing in an empty lecture hall, but I'm fervently trying to imagine you. And I hope that over the next half hour I'll be able to illuminate some of what I consider to be the real qualities of video game and video game design that can make it a powerful ally or tool to people like me interested in serious mental illness. As an overview, I'm going to cover a number, well, three main parts. And the first is really, I can deal with briefly, which is why would somebody like me, a psychiatrist, be interested in video games? After all, there are plenty of people out there who wave their pitchforks and panic about the detrimental impact of video games. We're told that they are violence-inducing, that they're habit-forming, even addictive. We're told that they're socially constraining, that they're a waste of time, that they're a waste of potential in our young people. And there are many narratives out there about the ill effects that they can have, and many people who really should know better citing evidence that really doesn't support those narratives. But I'm not going to turn this into a defense, because I don't think that's necessary here. What I want to do is turn it into a description of why I, as a psychiatrist, think that video games actually have an enormous amount to offer. I see them as vivid, compelling, immersive, rich experiences, very enjoyable but not necessarily enjoyable experiences that can help to represent, to even induce psychological states and provide incredibly powerful settings in which we can record and monitor those states. And I'm going to do that through two case studies. The first one is really an illustration from a game that I collaborated on, produced and released in 2017 by the Cambridge video game design studio, Ninja Theory. And this is just an example of how a game can represent psychological states. In this case, represent the state of psychosis or trauma-induced psychosis. And I just want to give you a sense of how the game can communicate those experiences and inform people in a deeper way, not just by providing the information, but by actually providing the experience, providing the sense of what it might be like to be frightened and confused and experiencing hallucinations. And through that, how it can actually give people experiences that challenge the stigma. And stigma is a huge part of the suffering of mental illness. The second case study is really about taking that potential of video games into a more active role, the possibility that we can measure, record, and even therapeutically intervene using video game design. So to begin with, and that's, sorry, I should say that the Insight project, which again, both of these projects are really a result of a collaboration between University of Cambridge and Ninja Theory. Sorry, I'm just moving my slide forward. So starting with Hellblade, the video game. In about 2014, I was emailed by Dom Matthews, production manager at Ninja Theory, and put in contact with Tamim Antoniades, who's the creative designer. And they were just beginning to develop the idea for a game about a young woman, a young Celtic warrior who has a trauma-induced psychosis. At that stage, all that they were contacting me for really was to get some sort of sense of the facts. They wanted a sensitive, factually accurate portrayal. And so we met and talked, and at that stage their ideas were fairly rudimentary. They had some basic tenets of the story, that she was a Pictish Celt who had been traumatized by the invasion of the Vikings, and she was on a quest to save her lover's soul in the Viking heartland of Helheim. It described, they said, the game as a whole described her background of having unusual psychological experiences, but also a growing fear and psychological trauma and visions and voices. And that's what we began to talk about. And this led to a 3-year collaboration that introduced them to a group of people from Recovery College East, which is a group of individuals who all themselves have lived experience of psychosis and who are willing to come on board and get involved in discussions with me and with the game company. We were supported by the Wellcome Trust, and the idea was to do as much as we could to make this a sensitive, factual representation of the experience. And over that 3 years, a number of principles emerged. I'm just playing a little clip from the video game to give you a sense of it as a young woman who is feeling an encroaching darkness and fear and a sense of confusion and bewilderment. And as we were developing this game, a number of sort of principles and ways of working emerged that became very useful. So it began with just some fairly didactic, even lectures by me to the video game designers, talking about psychosis, about the neuroscience of it. And then, as the people with their own lived experience of psychosis became involved, it was much more about roundtable discussions, about them describing experiences, talking to the artists trying to represent them, going back in an iterative way, changing, developing, updating them. And there was an openness from the outset, so that the game designers really wanted to listen and to change as a consequence of what they were being told. And also they were actually releasing material onto the internet to get other opinions as they were developing it. And the emerging principles really were, I mean, the primary principle, I think, was one that was articulated by Jenny Essen, who was one of the people with lived experience, who sadly died since. She said it can't be Disney, and I think that was a good principle that we all adhere to. There was nothing light or fluffy about this. It was a dark and deep portrayal of a very bewildering and frightening experience, and it's the story of a person, not an illness. So it wasn't trying to strive to represent all of the textbook experiences, but rather to explain how it might feel in one person, if you like. And that made her a hero, which I think was a very powerful aspect of what made the game a success. We were able to create, well, the artists were able to create within the game a number of experiences that people described, and I just want to give some examples of those. You'll see that on this video. This initially is one of our roundtable discussions. And they were able to describe a number of the visual experiences they had, some of them very disturbing and unpleasant. And those were embroidered into the game so that the player is experiencing these as they work through this 7 or 8 hour game. And at the same time, they described the voices that they were hearing, the auditory hallucinations. And Ninja Theory worked hard with binaural recordings to produce a very, very striking and deeply disturbing representation, which the player experiences wearing headphones throughout the game. And I'm just going to play that. I should warn you that this can be a bit distressing, so you may want to mute if it is.
They're watching. They're watching. They know you're here. They know you're here. You did this. You did this. Your fault. You did this. You did this.
So you get a sense that this wasn't a light game. This was a very dark and heavy experience for the player. And to be honest, the designers always said, well, if we break even with this, we'll be very fortunate. And I think there was always a sense it might become a cult game, but it would never be terribly popular. But actually, its reception was extraordinarily powerful. It won 5 BAFTAs, it won a number of other awards within the game industry. And generated some really quite powerful and unusual experiences for people like me who, as you imagine, had never actually accepted a BAFTA before. It won a Royal College of Psychiatrists award, which I think was one of my proudest moments, because we were able to go with the team, Tamim and Dom, and with the members of Recovery College to the Royal College, and they were able to give the speech to pick up the award, and it was a fantastic accolade, one that we're very proud of. But perhaps more than that, and something that I hadn't anticipated, but it had a huge impact on me as a psychiatrist, was I started receiving emails and messages from people, and certainly the studio received far more than I did, and they were like this, the one I'm showing you now. And the striking thing was that people were experiencing something quite novel to them, which was the capacity to have their experiences represented in a way that they could show to other people. Mental illness is often invisible and silent, and that's one of the things that makes it so pernicious. And yet to have this representation of experience and to be able to show it to a loved one and let them play through it was something that people deeply appreciated, and they made that appreciation clear over and over again. Some of the messages that we got were even more powerful, as illustrated on this tweet from somebody who I've kept anonymous. So it was a huge sense of having done something really useful just through making a game, and a game that was designed as a game, not as a piece of a documentary or edutainment, as they call it. It's subsequently been studied itself as within the scientific community for its effects, and it's been shown to have an appreciable and significant effect on stigma. And that's what really led Tamim and me to consider extending this collaboration and looking at the possibility that we could take it further and actually not just use video games to represent, but even to work for the good, for a therapeutic input. And that's what the Insight project is about, and I'm going to just spend 10 minutes telling you about that now. So the basic principle is one that I've known for a long time, although I haven't always articulated it, and that's that people like me, clinicians and researchers, are actually in the business, as we study psychological states, of just creating contexts and scenarios that challenge psychological processes or engage those processes. The idea is that we present a task to someone and then we record and measure their responses, and we can, through that, we hope, more deeply understand how these processes work and interact, and we can understand the ways in which the processes might be altered or disturbed in some way. And we might do this with something like attention or language or memory, and that's how we try and get at these processes. We give people tasks. And ultimately, we hope that by that deeper understanding, we can discover new avenues for treatment. So in essence, we are making games for people to play. We don't call them games, but we are issuing them with challenges that they have to work their way through, puzzles. And the real problem is that our games are terrible. They're really not very good. The problems with our games are that they're necessarily very oversimplified. We have very limited skills, so we often have just shapes on a screen, or words to remember, or just fairly boring psychological task stuff. And our measurements are equally rudimentary. So they might be a binary yes/no, or they might be right or wrong. Sometimes we become more ambitious, but they tend to be very simple. The games that we make are also very boring. Participants don't really want to play them. We actually pay them to play them sometimes. And often, if we're going to be serious about psychological therapies, we need to have situations where people are truly engaged and want to go back to it and learn. Because psychological change is often about learning, about re-evaluating, changing strategies. And so we need to present situations that people want to come back to, that they don't just treat as homework. And also situations that they won't easily become distracted from. So it's difficult to engender requisite levels of motivation in people. We need to be able to convince them that the task that they're doing is worth doing, that there's a reason for it. And people are very good. They're very helpful, they're very tolerant, and so they'll sit down and they'll do our boring tasks. But even with the best will in the world, they can find it hard to truly engage with it. And of course there are people who find it, because of a mental illness or because of psychological difficulties, find it even harder to engage with the tasks. And within the tasks, of course, we set them goals, and we can try and motivate them to achieve those goals by giving them points or even financial rewards. But again, it's not really something that grabs them fully. And a consequence of that is that they can spend a lot of their time distracted or not particularly worried about whether they do something as well as they can or not. And this is a profound problem with understanding the results of our psychological tasks, our games. So the final thing, and I think this is often neglected, but it's actually absolutely crucial. There's a lack of an overall narrative. Somebody comes in, they very kindly have volunteered for a study, or they've been asked to come in and for a few tests. They sit down in a fairly sparse room, and they do these tasks. And there's no sense of why they're doing it, what the value of the actions or the psychological processes they're enacting take. And I think we've neglected this for a long time, but it's so detached from the real world that that any results need to be interpreted with great caution. So to give you an example, on the left here, as you look at it, is the Hooper visual organization task, where you have to rearrange the shapes to make an object. And on the right is just a simple puzzle I've taken from a fairly run-of-the-mill game called Uncharted, or it's one of the Uncharted franchise. And both of them involve the same sorts of psychological processes, which is essentially trying to rearrange things in order to make an object, make a whole object. But the one on the right occurs in the context of somebody being trapped, needing to find the necessary tokens to get out, to move on to the next phase of the game. And as a consequence, they're already more engaged. It's also a more compelling game to play, and then if you're successful, you get this very satisfying clunk as a portcullis opens and you can go in and pick up a token. And for somebody who's actually enjoying the game as a whole and motivated to complete it, that's far more compelling way of testing these skills than the standard psychological test on the left. So that's one thing. We make games as scientists, and we make bad games. The second thing that lies behind this Insight project is there has actually been an interesting shift in the emphasis in my field, in cognitive neuroscience. So when I started training, we used to think of the brain as a sort of separate organ doing its processes, and we would examine those processes as best we could, attention, language, memory, and so forth. But we were neglecting a lot of the time the fact that the brain is not a disembodied organ. It's part of an agent, a biological entity that's moving around the world, that is sending its signals. The brain is embodied, but also it's embedded in a real world. We cannot ignore the context in which the processes are taking place. And of course, it's part of an actively participating organism. It's embodied, embedded, and inactive. And to neglect those is, I think, means that we will end up with a less than comprehensive understanding. This idea of embodiment certainly goes back actually to William James, the so-called father of psychology. James recognized that many of our emotional states and our psychological experiences are actually profoundly driven, if not constituted, of physical sensations. So he talked a lot about anger and fear, and imagined what would happen if you stripped away the physical sensations, the racing heart, the clammy palms, the tightness in the chest. And his conclusion was actually there would be very little left of that emotion. Now, most of us wouldn't entirely subscribe to that extreme view, but nonetheless, I think the idea that the brain is embodied and that our psychological experiences are a result of our bodily experiences is nonetheless a very powerful part of the equation. We can take an example such as this, a roller coaster ride. Now, much of what you will experience in that comes from the feelings that you have, your racing heart, gasping for breath, butterflies in the stomach, the lurching sensation. That's what generates the emotion. But actually, in many people it generates a very pleasurable emotion. In some people it would generate sheer terror. And it's important to remember that it's the world that you're embedded in that determines how the bodily signals are translated into emotions. So the physical experiences that you have on a roller coaster, you may enjoy them a great deal, but you could have almost identical physical sensations in an airplane, and you would hate them. You'd be absolutely terrified because they would mean something different. Similarly, whether you're inactive or not, whether you have some control, will also make a big difference to how you experience that. So the essence is we need to bring together these 3 E's of cognition: embodiment, embeddedness, and inactiveness. And that's really the essence of what we're trying to do in collaboration with Ninja Theory, which is to try and take these immersive, enjoyable qualities of a game and embed the player in this rich, convincing world, whether it's virtual reality or a game world, and that can be used to channel and shape their experiences. Of course, games are different from a number of other art forms in that they're very primarily participatory. Your experience does depend on the decisions you make and the actions you take. So they offer us also the opportunity of making sure that the experience is inactive, and we can explore that. And then finally, the embodiment. So it's possible, and we've been working hard on this, to take the physiological signals from the player themselves and use that to update the game mechanics in real time, so that they have an embodied experience that is shaping the game that they are playing. And I just want to touch, in the final few minutes, briefly on each of those principles. Essentially, there's a broad plan to try and work our way through those through a series of experimental endeavors that are they're taking the rough format that you see on this slide in front of you. So we're beginning by trying to characterize what we're calling the biomarkers of stress. So we're very interested in whether we can use games to challenge anxiety and stress. And the biomarkers, I just mean the cardiac response, the respiratory response, skin conductance, the clamminess of the skin, how our eyes are behaving, where our gaze is directed, our pupil diameter, that sort of thing. The next phase, having identified those patterns, is to find engaging ways to represent them back to the player. So the person has if you like, an external representation of what's going on in their body. And then finally, to devise games and scenarios in which the gameplay depends on them managing their bodily responses. The idea here is that if you can manage your physical responses to stress, then you're able to manage stress, because a lot of the experience of stress is actually determined by the physical responses. And this is sometimes known as biofeedback. You feed back the biology to the person and get them to learn to control it. So the first part, characterizing the biomarkers. The great thing about working with video game companies is that they know very well how to induce emotions in people, particularly fear and anxiety. And so they've developed with us a series of virtual reality experiences that are very kind, healthy volunteers, including ourselves, are participating in order for us to measure the stress responses. And just as a sort of content warning, the next slide just gives a very brief representation of one of those. So if you don't like spiders, you might want to look away just for a moment. So here you're sitting in a corridor, you're in virtual reality, so it really feels like you're there, surrounded by small spiders, and then towards the end of the experience, after about 5 minutes, this beauty comes out and starts walking towards you. And I've sat through this experience 5 or 6 times now, and every time my heart rate goes up by at least 20 beats a minute. I just can't get used to it. It's a very, very powerful way of inducing stress, and therefore of measuring the physical responses. I'm just going to move on to the next slide for those of you who are looking away. But just a point about this induction of stress. The game designers have produced a number of scenarios, so it's not all spiders. We've also got standard ones like heights. We've got a social phobia where somebody is standing, as I am, in front of an auditorium trying to give a speech when their auto cue fails. We also have a couple of horror experiences. So the game designers have really pulled out all the stops to give us stress so that we can then make our measurements. So the next thing is to find these engaging, both direct and indirect ways to represent those physical changes back to the participants. So we can just take a simple graphical response. So we could represent the person's heart back to them, as I've done here within the skeleton, or we could just present the various readouts from the graphs. All of that is a meaningful representation of their bodily response. But we can also become more elaborate, more artistic, so present the whole body, represent the vasculature, represent the lungs. There's, you know, when you're working with artists of this quality, you can really ask them for a huge amount, and they can produce really powerful experiences, which as a cognitive neuroscientist I find incredible. One can also represent in very abstract ways. This is the cardiovascular system done in an abstract way. So you'll notice that used a combination of abstract visual representations to represent the heartbeat and the heart rate variability, and also the strength of the pulse. But also an auditory input, and of course, you know, I think the auditory side of things can be very powerful. And then the third arm of the Insight project is essentially our attempt to begin to devise games and scenarios in which the user's experience is determined by how well they're able to control their physiological state. So they're actually working on a whole host of possibilities here that traverse many different scenarios, but this is just one early example. Sorry, I'll skip through that. This is just one early example where you're on a boat and essentially the turbulence of the ocean is connected up to your heartbeat. So your ability to make it forward smoothly to the harbour is dependent on your ability to manage your heartbeat. And you can do it either way, either trying to get people to increase or to decrease their heartbeat. The point is, the game mechanics are sensitive to your bodily state. So I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of plans that we have largely, some of the work that's been done. A lot of it is still in preparation. But what I really wanted to do was not present you with a fait accompli, but really to illuminate for you what I think are the amazingly powerful aspects of video games and video game design and video game technology such as virtual reality that I think is going to be a really powerful ally to the psychiatrist and to the neuroscience researcher going forward. Some of these things can be run online, which of course in the current climate is also another powerful aspect of the approach. And I have to acknowledge as I close that working with Ninja Theory, a truly remarkable group of people who seem to be totally committed to making video games that are actually of use, of benefit to people, as well as being, you know, amazing games in themselves. That's a real privilege to me. And I've been well supported by University of Cambridge in setting up this collaboration, and also by the Cambridge and Peterborough Mental Health Trust, who are a big part of our plans. And I just close to say that Ninja Theory actually have funded a PhD student, Lucy Daniel Watanabe, who is running a number of the experiments that I've alluded to briefly. So on that note, I'm happy to take questions. So thank you very much. I'll just move straight on to the questions, I guess. The text is quite small for me, so I'm just going to put my specs on. Hang on a sec. So, Carol Maguire, firstly, thank you for your kind comment. You say it's fantastic. Please can you follow this up for PTSD and for autism or other neurodiversities? You mentioned that the National Autistic Society did a brief program called Too Much Information, but we sorely need more ways to communicate neurodiverse experience to neurotypicals. So thank you very much for that question, Carol, and for the kind comment. We are keen to follow this up for post-traumatic stress disorder, and I should add that, you know, we're not alone in this. There are other groups in the US and a virtual reality group in Oxford who are working on social anxiety and other forms of phobia. I think the idea of following it up and looking at neurodiverse population is going to be a really important part of this. Part of that is because, as I hope I've shown you, these games, in the right hands, with the right video game designers and makers, can really produce something quite special. And I would love to see what they could do, working with neurodiverse populations to try and create experiences that could then be communicated to other people. So these are all things that I think, I can only concur with you that they're important things to follow up. Anonymous attendee, what do you think about the idea that is quite prominent in society at the moment that violent behaviour and increasing youth crime rates can be linked to violent video games such as Grand Theft Auto? That's a sort of elephant in the room, I suppose, and important to address. Video games have had pretty poor press in many areas. So as I alluded to at the beginning, they've been accused of being violence-inducing. They've also been accused of being addictive. If we actually step back from the panic, and incidentally, the panic often arises when something happens, such as a school shooting in America, which is always a tragic occurrence and something that people naturally want to get to the bottom of, to make sense of. And very often you'll find that the perpetrator has been a player of video games, and so the finger of accusation gets levelled at the games themselves. Sometimes you feel forced to ask why people are more worried about virtual violence in games than they are about real violence with real guns. But even leaving that aside, if you actually do the research as well as can be done, and this is observational studies and experimental studies, which themselves are very limited, actually there is no real evidence that video games increase violent tendencies. There's even some evidence that they reduce it. Now, I'm not going to make that as a claim, but I'd just like to say, if we are going to go down that route and start accusing them, we really do need to back it up with evidence. A further question from an anonymous attendee. In a world where we have all moved towards more towards working and living through online mediums, are you finding that video games have become a more prominent form of socializing? And do you think this will have a negative impact on people's ability to socialize in person? That's a terrific question, and it's actually got some real nuggets in there, more than one. The first one, the idea that since we moved to being a more online society, is there a greater tendency to rely on video games for socializing? I think yes, indubitably. I think a lot of people who probably wouldn't have done so before have moved towards actually meeting their friends in online forums, whether they're playing Minecraft or whatever. They're using video games as the setting in which they meet each other. I think that's been a good thing generally, and I think it's quite telling that the World Health Organization, who 2 or 3 years ago were very keen to examine the possibility of video games as addictive and quite toxic medium, have actually at the height of the pandemic, were writing some very complimentary things about what online internet experiences and video games were doing. So I think they've been largely powerful. The question then is, have they created in people a habit which will make them less good at face-to-face socializing when we all emerge blinking into the sunlight? I think time alone will tell, but I feel that video games, like any hobby or pastime or cultural experience, are always going to have a detrimental side for those people who misuse them or overuse them or misappropriate them. And I think just like anything, we have to be aware of that and be willing to acknowledge it and, where necessary, intervene and treat. And I think there's probably a small-ish group of people who have real problems playing games, and as a consequence, the rest of their life gets neglected. I sort of don't think that that's as major a problem as many people would argue. I think the benefits of gameplay and socializing through gameplay far outweigh the disadvantages. And also, referring back to the previous question, some people, neurodiverse people, actually find that is the safest and most enjoyable social setting that they can have. And if it weren't for that, then actually they wouldn't then go out into the world and meet real people, because they'd have profound difficulties with that. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a core of people who actually get what social interactions they want and need from video games, but that doesn't mean we should then be pressing them to find other ways of doing it. Pressing on. Peter Bryant, thank you. In what ways will this work also strengthen and deepen understanding that the brain is embodied, embedded, and inactive? I suppose that's a good question, because it's taking as its fundamental principle the fact that the brain is embodied, embedded, and inactive. So it might be slightly disingenuous of me to then start speculating on how I can circle back. But I think as a general point about video games, I think because they allow us to create tasks or create games that are within a much richer world, within a much more elaborate experience, then, and also one that's very participatory. So the person controlling the character in the video game has a remarkable number of options for decision making and actions that they may want to take, as well as actions they may want to withhold, including moral decisions. And I think that mere fact allows a good experimenter to capitalize and to actually examine embeddedness and inactiveness. And as I've shown, you can also hook people up when they're playing a game, so you get the bodily signals. So I think, although I'm not really answering your question by telling you the ways in which it can happen, I just think as a general principle, the nature of the games will allow people to explore ideas that they couldn't possibly explore with more standard, limited approaches. I suppose one example, just there was a video game released around about the same time as Hellblade, actually, called Sea Hero Quest, which was an attempt to examine how people's navigational skills varied across society, across gender and so forth. And that involved people downloading an app and navigating in a little make-believe world. So it was an embedded and an inactive game, and it generated a real, I think probably quite new insights into navigational abilities, which previously are often tested in humans anyway, in much more rudimentary ways. Carol actually asked a question, how can we join in? If you visit insightproject.com, there are options for making contact with the team. At the moment, we've been largely delayed by the pandemic, and a lot of our work has been sort of shuffled back in time. But if you have ideas, you can make contact with the Insight Project or email me, and I'd be happy to talk. Would there be any scope to develop games that might help develop empathy, not just in children with ASD, but those with psychopathies or asocial traits? So there is work going on in Oxford, the Oxford VR group, which is using therapists to help people deal with social situations. Now that's one thing. A social situation can be navigated through practice and through adhering to certain sort of generic rules. But the idea of developing empathy through games, I think, is an interesting one. I mean, I think to answer it properly, I'd probably need to know much more about empathy than I do. But if you look at what's going on in the virtual reality world in terms of representing humans and human facial expressions, it's moved so far within the last 5 years, to the point where you can go onto YouTube and look at the latest avatars, and actually they're indistinguishable from humans. And of course, with things like AI and machine learning, it's possible to program those avatars to respond in more and more naturalistic ways. Now, of course, you can imagine this is could be a force for evil quite easily. But I think used in the right way, this extraordinary technical and artistic development might offer new ways of allowing people to embed themselves in situations, let's say in virtual reality, to be faced with a very convincing avatar that will respond to them in a pre-programmed way, allowing them to develop how they're communicating, and perhaps through that to develop an understanding of the mental processes in other people's. I mean, I'm speculating wildly, but I do think that the technology has got to the point where you could feasibly sit in a virtual reality environment and not be sure if you were faced with an avatar or a human. Shouldn't have put my glasses away. There we are. So that seems to be all of the questions as far as I can tell. Oh no, sorry, I can scroll down. Silly me. So William Hargreaves, thank you for your compliment. Might this be a move towards virtual AI psychotherapy personally tailored to the needs of the client? Okay, well, I should have got to your question first before I rambled on in the last one. I think you put it very nicely. This could potentially have virtual therapists embedded in a setting. Now, in a virtual reality setting, but I'm at the same time I'm quite cautious about that, because one thing I know from my own practice in psychiatry is that there are no rules that you can program to make you good at being with another person who is in distress and in pain. And if we assume simply that you can program that into an avatar, it's going to raise a whole host of questions. And my fear is that if people rush to do this, as some people I think might be, there may be a danger of creating bad virtual therapists, essentially. So I give a sort of cautious response to that. I think it's a direction to explore, but I think we need to be very careful about assuming that just because we've captured a realistic type of therapist or avatar doesn't mean we've captured a good one. Kirsten Lamb, thank you. Given that much video game play is done collaboratively with friends remotely, is there any plan to make the therapeutic approach collaborative within groups of people? So the short answer is yes, that the team at Ninja Theory are actually very keen to explore that as a more remote possibility, so that people are actually, you can imagine the situation in which people were actually helping each other to control their responses to stress and to give their own tips in the medium of a game. And I think that's really exciting because, as you say, lots of people get a huge amount from playing games collaboratively. And that's one thing I didn't mention, perhaps should have. I mentioned the fact that games are very realistic, immersive, participatory, but the fact that they're collaborative is also something that has really grown in recent years. Anonymous, thank you for your compliment. Even as an expert in psychosis, did you change your mind about aspects of this illness? Do you feel you came to understand better thanks to the video game? Yeah, a short answer is yes, absolutely, because I was put in a very different situation from my normal clinical practice, which was to sit down with people as equals, not in a sort of doctor-patient relationship, but as people who were searching for people who were all pointing towards the same goal. And when they described their experiences, my job wasn't to decide that was abnormal or to decide that I needed to help with it. My job was just to ask about it and be curious. And a consequence of that is that I asked questions that I probably would never have asked before and learnt things that I would never have learnt in clinical practice. So the short answer is it was enormously enriching as a clinician. And one particular thing I learnt that I just should have known, but perhaps it was only when I was seeing the enormous reaction on social media after Hellblade was released, is that merely validating people's experiences, recognizing them, representing them, saying that this is what it might be like, and allowing them to show it to other people is enormously powerful. And it's very important to remember that. It's not all about getting rid of the experiences or treating them as pathological, but allowing people to describe them and represent them and share them. Another question. Games are colourful and engaging, more so than real life. Is this what we get addicted to? I can see this would make them useful for treatment, but is there a danger we may find life boring afterwards? Yeah, so the question of game addiction, it's right out there as one of the fears. I'm dubious about whether people truly get addicted to games. I think there's a core of people who play them far too much to the detriment of the rest of their lives and probably do meet the criterion for addictive behavior, addictive experiences. But the vast majority of people, I think, know the difference between the virtual and the real world. Having said that, I think your point has to be treated with respect and caution, and we need to be very careful that the shift towards, as another questioner has put it, towards a more online life, doesn't erode our skills of dealing with real life, and I think that's at the nub of what you're saying. We need to respect that possibility and to keep scrutinizing it. Jürgen Ivanis, from Vienna. Thank you for your lovely comments. Do you run projects in the area of healthcare and the future usage of avatars as healthcare givers? Currently, there's a running discussion how they should look, how they would affect us. Firstly, thank you for joining us from Vienna, and thank you for your kind comments. So I've sort of dealt with this question a bit, but your question has reminded me that, of course, do we want to strive for realistic avatars? Because there's this phenomenon, the so-called uncanny valley, where if something looks very, very realistic but isn't, that actually induces a feeling of, if you like, unease, anxiety, uncanniness in a person. So, should it be that we're actually designing avatars that are otherworldly, that are alien or anthropomorphic animals? I don't know. These things could be explored. It's a great question. How lifelike should they be? So just scrolling down, and I think, yeah. So in recent years, multiplayer online games have gained a large number of players due to the spread of smart devices, and more games have their own unique societies. Is it possible the social relationship skills acquired in games, such as concessions, can be generalized to the construction of social relationships in reality? That's a great point, is that there may be things in the social relationship in games that we don't get in reality, and we shouldn't ignore that. Such as concessions, such as sharing your own resources with someone so that they can make it to the next level. I hadn't really thought in those terms. It shouldn't always be about what you've lost, but also what you're gaining. And then finally, I think we'll make this the last question because we need to wrap up on time. 2 minutes. Francis, you were talking about video games as a unit. Surely there's a huge range of video games, good and bad. Well, I couldn't put it better. Yes, I have. For reasons of time and because it's a lecture, I've had to simplify the way in which I presented them. As you say, video games are so many things to so many people, from a simple, moving the fruit around on your iPhone to engaging in a sort of highly complex collaborative venture, navigating enormous worlds. People find, as they do with any aspects of culture, they find the things they're looking for in video games that differ. There are as many different things they're looking for as there are different people. So I suppose there's no real answer to your point except to acknowledge it. There are a huge range of video games, and there will be some good and some bad ones. And I think if we capitalize on the good, then there's an enormous amount we can bring to science, psychiatry, and life in general. So on that note, with 30-odd seconds left, I think we should draw it to a close. Oh, and this is, oh dear.